They promised me the stars. I believed them once, standing in the recruitment line on Varsavia with 200 other desperate souls, watching the holo-projections of distant worlds and infinite opportunities. Now I know the truth. The stars are not for people like me. We are the oil in the machine, the expendable components that keep the great ships moving through the void. My name was Kael Sindri. Now I am Servant Designate Theta-Seven-Three-Five. And this is what it means to serve aboard a rogue trader's vessel. The day the recruitment team arrived, the factorum bells rang 3 times. In the underhive of Varsavia, this meant opportunity or death, and often both arrived wearing the same face. I was 23 years old, working 16-hour shifts in a reclamation facility where we stripped corroded metal from 1,000-year-old machinery for recycling. The pay kept me alive, barely, in a hab block I shared with 11 other workers. My mother had died 2 years prior from lung rot. My father, I had never known. The Imperium's bureaucracy recorded my existence, but cared nothing for my continued survival. When the bells rang, we stopped our work and climbed toward the surface. Thousands of us, emerging from the depths like insects drawn to light. The recruitment banners hung from every spire, glorious images of the God Emperor's servants traveling among the stars, exploring unknown worlds, bringing the light of Terra to the darkness beyond. The holo-projections showed clean quarters, adequate food, the dignity of meaningful service. Lies, though I did not know this yet. The recruitment station had been erected in Factorum Plaza Secundus, a massive adamantium structure bristling with auspex sensors and armed guards. House Corvallis, one of the sector's ancient rogue trader dynasties, required personnel for their flagship. The propaganda said we would be crew. The fine print, which few could read and fewer bothered to, said servant. The distinction would prove infinite. We queued for hours. The line stretched across the plaza and down 3 levels. A river of desperate humanity hoping for escape from Varsavia's grinding poverty. I stood between a woman my age named Sarai, who had been a textile worker, and an older man called Ven, who claimed to have once served in the Planetary Defense Force. We did not speak much. Hope and fear mixed into something that made conversation difficult. The selection process was brutal and immediate. At the front of the line, 3 stations had been established. At the first, a Medicae servitor performed rapid physical assessment with clicking mechadendrites and dead eyes that had once been human. Those deemed too weak, too sick, or too damaged were pulled from the line and directed toward a separate gate. I never learned where that gate led. At the second station, a chapter serf checked for obvious mutations or signs of heresy, examining our skin for marks, our eyes for wrongness, asking questions about our faith in the God Emperor. At the third station, an administratum clerk recorded our information into a massive data slate, assigning us identification numbers that would replace our names. I passed the first station. My body, hardened by years of manual labor, showed adequate strength and no immediate signs of disease. I passed the second station by reciting the prayers my mother had taught me. Simple devotions that every child of the Imperium learned. At the third station, the clerk barely looked at me as he recorded my details and pressed a brand against my left forearm. The pain was sharp and immediate, the smell of burning flesh acrid. When he pulled the brand away, it left the mark of House Corvallis, a stylized ship's prow surrounded by stars, forever marking me as their property. Servant Designate Theta-Seven-Three-Five, the clerk intoned in a bored voice. Report to Transport Shuttle Designation 4. Departure in 2 hours. Bring nothing. All necessary items will be provided. 2 hours to say goodbye to everything I had ever known. I returned to the hab block, moving through familiar corridors that suddenly seemed precious in their mundane ugliness. My few possessions, a spare set of clothes, a small icon of the Emperor my mother had given me, a bent knife I used for eating, all of it would remain behind. I stood in that cramped space where I had lived my entire life, trying to memorize details I knew would fade. The water stain on the ceiling that looked like an aquila, the loose rivet in the corner where I had hidden my meager savings, the scratches on the wall where previous tenants had marked time or recorded names. In the end, I took only the icon, small enough to hide in my palm. If they found it and took it, so be it. But I could not leave with nothing of my former life. The shuttle pad was chaos. Hundreds of new servants milling about, some crying, others staring blankly ahead. Armed guards kept us organized into lines, barking orders that were more about establishing dominance than communicating information. I found myself standing near Sarai from the queue. Her eyes were red from weeping, but her jaw was set with determination. "Did you say goodbye to anyone?" she asked quietly. "No one left to say goodbye to," I replied. "3 younger siblings. They will have to manage without my wages now." She laughed, a sound without humor. "Perhaps this is better. One less mouth feeding from the family share." Before I could respond, a servo skull drifted overhead, its vox casters crackling to life. "Servants of House Corvallis, board your assigned shuttles immediately. Delays will not be tolerated. Service to the dynasty begins now." We moved toward the shuttles. Bulky, atmospheric craft designed for cargo transport rather than passenger comfort. The interior was a metal shell with bench seating along the walls and cargo netting hanging from the ceiling. 60 of us were packed into a space meant for perhaps 40. The loading ramp closed with a pneumatic hiss, and the engines began their deafening roar. I had never flown before. Few underhive workers ever did. The sensation of lifting from the ground was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, my stomach lurching as the shuttle's inertial dampeners struggled with the load. Through the small viewports, I caught my last glimpses of Varsavia. The hive spires reaching desperately toward a sky choked with industrial smog. The factorums belching smoke and waste. The millions of souls grinding out their lives in service to the Imperium's endless appetite for production. From this height, it all seemed so small, so insignificant. Then we rose above the cloud layer, and I saw the sky. The real sky, not the orange-gray haze that passed for daylight in the underhive. Stars, thousands of them, scattered across the darkness of space, and among them, ships, dozens of vessels in orbit around Varsavia, from small system monitors to massive bulk haulers. But one dwarfed them all. The eternal dividend hung in the void like a Gothic cathedral carved from adamantium and devotion. It was impossible to judge its true size from the shuttle, but it seemed to fill the viewport. A mountain of metal bristling with weapons, batteries, sensor arrays, and the architectural flourishes that marked it as a vessel of an ancient and wealthy dynasty. Flying buttresses served no purpose in the void, yet they soared from the ship's flanks. Gargoyles and aquilas adorned every surface. Stained glass windows, real glass that must have cost fortunes to maintain, glowed with interior light from what I would later learn were the noble quarters. The ship was not merely functional. It was a statement of power and permanence, a declaration that House Corvallis had ruled the void for millennia and would continue to do so. "Emperor's mercy," Ven whispered beside me. "I served on Navy vessels during my conscription. Never saw anything like that." As our shuttle approached, the true scale became apparent. The landing bay we were directed toward was merely one of dozens, a cavern carved into the ship's flank large enough to swallow our shuttle without effort. We passed through the atmospheric containment field, feeling the shuttle shudder as it transitioned from void to pressurized environment, and settled onto a landing pad with a jarring impact that threw several servants to the floor. The ramp opened, and light flooded in, harsh and white and sterile. A voice boomed over voxcasters that must have been installed throughout the bay. "Exit the shuttle in orderly fashion. Form ranks on the designated markers. Do not speak. Do not move from your position once established. You will be addressed shortly." We stumbled out into the landing bay, and I experienced my first true understanding of what I had entered. The bay was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling lost in shadows far above. Dozens of shuttles were landing or departing, loading and unloading cargo that ranged from standard supplies to items covered in stasis tarps that hummed with unknown power. Servitors moved among the cargo, their human components grafted to machinery with the casual efficiency of the mechanicus, their minds lobotomized into simple obedience. Chapter serfs in House Corvallis livery-directed operations with data slates and barked orders. And everywhere, the symbols of the dynasty and the Imperium, Aquilus and ship-prow icons, purity seals and devotional scrolls. We formed our ranks as ordered, 600 new servants arranged in neat rows while the ship's business continued around us, indifferent to our arrival. We waited for 20 minutes in silence before he arrived. Head Steward Vask was a thin man who moved with the precise efficiency of an automaton, though he retained all his human parts. His uniform was immaculate, black fabric with the House Corvallis crest embroidered in silver thread over his heart. His face was weathered but unreadable, eyes that had seen everything and been moved by nothing. He walked the ranks slowly, studying us with the detached interest of someone cataloging inventory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the bay without amplification. Trained over decades to project authority, you are now property of House Corvallis. You will serve until death or until the dynasty determines you are no longer useful, at which point you will be processed according to imperial regulations. These are not threats. They are statements of fact. Your existence has one purpose: to maintain the operation of this vessel and advance the interests of the dynasty. If you perform adequately, you will be housed, fed, and allowed to live. There is no alternative, no appeal, no exception. He paused, letting his words settle over us like a shroud. Some of you are wondering if you made a mistake. The answer is no. You made no decision. You were selected because the dynasty required personnel. Whether you would have chosen this or not is irrelevant. You are here. This is your reality. Acceptance will make your service easier. Resistance will make it shorter. Vask divided us into classifications with the cold efficiency of a meat processor sorting cuts. The 600 new servants were assessed based on our recorded skills, physical capabilities, and the immediate needs of various ship sections. Most of us, lacking specialized training, were designated as general menials, the lowest tier in the servant hierarchy. A fortunate few with literacy or technical knowledge were marked as ratings, a marginal improvement in status. A very small number, those who showed particular cleanliness or composure, were selected for household staff, serving in the upper decks where the dynasty actually lived. I was designated General Menial, assigned to Maintenance Section Theta-Seven. The number was not coincidental. They stripped our names and replaced them with our assignments. I was Theta-Seven-Three-Five because I was the 35th servant assigned to Section Theta-Seven. Kael Sindri ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Only the designation remained. We were marched through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, our footsteps echoing off metal walls adorned with devotional inscriptions and the names of previous captains dating back 6,000 years. The ship was ancient, and every surface bore testament to its age. Newer sections grafted onto older ones, repairs visible as scars across the bulkheads, entire corridors sealed off behind welded blast doors marked with warnings in languages I could not read. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and the indefinable scent of too many humans living in enclosed spaces for too long. We passed crew members who did not acknowledge our existence, tech priests who muttered binary prayers as they tended to machine spirits, servitors that shambled past on mindless errands. The servant quarters for Section Theta-Seven were located on Deck 47, deep in the ship's lower levels where the wealthier passengers would never venture. The compartment, designated as our barracks, was a long, rectangular space with a vaulted ceiling supported by riveted iron beams. The walls were bare metal, rusted in places, patched in others. Running down the center of the compartment was a double row of support columns, and from these columns hung hammocks, hundreds of them, strung so close together that occupants could touch their neighbors on both sides. The hammocks were made of rough canvas, stained with the sweat and grime of previous occupants. At one end of the compartment were communal washing facilities, a series of cold water taps and metal basins. At the other end were the waste reclamation units, basic latrines that emptied into the ship's recycling systems. There were bunks for perhaps 70 people at most. Section Theta-7 had 218 servants assigned to it. "Hammocks are assigned by seniority," announced the section overseer, a grizzled man named Horvat who had served aboard the Eternal Dividend for 30 years. "New arrivals sleep in rotation based on shift schedules. If your shift ends and your hammock is occupied, you wait or you sleep on the floor. Theft of another servant's hammock will result in disciplinary action. Theft of possessions will be dealt with by the servants themselves, as I do not care to arbitrate such disputes." We were issued our uniforms, simple gray coveralls made of rough synthetic fabric that chafed against skin. We were given a single change of clothing, a thin blanket, and a small metal locker, 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, for personal items. The lockers had no locks. Privacy was not a consideration in the servant quarters. Food was distributed twice per day at designated meal periods. We queued in a communal dining area that serviced 3 maintenance sections. Nearly 700 servants fed in rotating shifts. The rations were corpse starch, a gray-brown paste made from recycled organic matter. The Imperium's efficiency extended even to death. Bodies that could not be recovered for proper burial were rendered down into nutritional compounds, mixed with synthetic proteins and mineral supplements, and extruded into blocks that could be stored indefinitely. It was technically food. It kept us alive. The taste was indescribable. Not because it was actively unpleasant, but because it had almost no taste at all. Just a vague organic wrongness that the mind tried desperately to categorize and failed. We were each allocated 1 liter of water per day for drinking. Washing water was unmetered, but recycled so many times that it tasted of chemicals and minerals. Learning to drink the daily ration slowly, making it last through an 18-hour shift, was a skill acquired through thirst and desperation. The first night, I could not sleep. The hammock swayed with every movement, and the movements of 200 other people in the compartment created a constant, subtle motion. The sounds were overwhelming. Snoring, coughing, whispered conversations, the endless mechanical symphony of the ship itself. The lights never fully dimmed, only reducing to a twilight level that allowed the overseers to monitor the compartment. I lay in that hammock, feeling the icon of the Emperor pressed against my chest where I had hidden it, and wondered if my mother had imagined this future when she taught me to pray. A woman in the hammock beside mine turned to look at me. Her face was thin, her hair cut short in the practical style of long-term servants. She was missing the last 2 fingers on her right hand, the stumps healed into smooth scar tissue. "First night is always the worst," she said quietly. "I am Maria. Been aboard 11 years now. You are new to Section Theta-7. "Kael," I replied, then corrected myself. "They try to take the names early," Maria said. "Makes it easier for them if we are just numbers. But we remember the names if we choose to. I still think of myself as Maria, even if the overseers call me Theta-7119. How do you survive 11 years of this?" She smiled without humor. "You learn the rules, the written ones they tell you, and the unwritten ones that matter more. Want to know the first unwritten rule?" I nodded. "Trust no one completely, but build alliances anyway. We are all trapped on this ship together. Some servants will betray you for an extra ration or to curry favor with the overseers. Others will share their water when you are dying of thirst. You learn to tell the difference, or you do not last long. Over the next few days, I began to understand the hierarchy that governed every interaction aboard the Eternal Dividend. At the top, unreachable and almost mythical, was Lord Captain Hadrian Corvallis, the current head of the dynasty and holder of the warrant of trade. Below him were the ship's officers, drawn from lesser nobility or elevated crew, who commanded various departments and sections. Below them were the crew proper, trained specialists who operated the ship's systems, maintained its weapons, navigated its course. These crew members were employed rather than owned, paid wages and allowed to leave service when their contracts expired, though few ever accumulated enough wealth to do so. Below the crew were the chapter serfs, servants who had proven themselves sufficiently valuable to be granted minor privileges and responsibilities. They wore better uniforms, ate better food, and exercised authority over the general servant population. Some chapter serfs had served for decades, becoming fixtures of the ship's operation, their expertise valued, if not respected. And at the bottom, vast and expendable, were the servants. We were the machinery's machinery, the human components that did the work too menial or dangerous to waste trained crew upon. We cleaned, we hauled, we repaired. We died, frequently, and were replaced from the endless supply of desperate souls on a million worlds who believed the propaganda about opportunity among the stars. Even within the servant population, there were distinctions. Household staff who served in the upper decks occupied a position of relative privilege, though they lived under constant scrutiny and could be demoted for the slightest failure. Personal servants who attended directly to noble family members existed in a strange liminal space, better treated than general servants, but utterly dependent on their master's continued favor. Ratings, who possessed specialized skills, had slightly better quarters and rations in exchange for their technical knowledge. General menials, the category I occupied, were interchangeable parts. Our lives had no individual value, only collective utility. When a menial died, another was assigned to take their place. The designation number was often reassigned immediately, the new servant inheriting not just the number but sometimes even the hammock of the deceased. My first work shift began 6 hours after we arrived aboard the Eternal Dividend. There was no grace period for adjustment, no training beyond the briefest orientation. Horvat assembled the new servants in section Theta-7 and explained our duties with brutal simplicity. This section maintains the plasma conduit systems on decks 40 through 55. Plasma conduits carry superheated ionized gas from the ship's reactors to various systems throughout the vessel. The conduits operate at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. They are shielded, but the shielding degrades over time and must be constantly repaired and replaced. This is your work. You will be issued basic tools and minimal protective equipment. You will work 18-hour shifts with 6 hours between shifts for rest, meals, and personal time. Questions? A young man, barely out of adolescence, raised his hand. What happens if the shielding fails while we are working on it? Horvat regarded him with the expression of someone who had answered this question many times before. You die, probably instantly, which is a mercy. The body will be recovered if possible, processed through reclamation, and your designation reassigned. Next question? There were no more questions. We were issued tool belts containing basic implements, wrenches, sealant applicators, diagnostic auspex units that barely functioned, and thick gloves that provided minimal protection against heat and sharp edges. We were given rebreather masks for sections where the atmosphere was toxic, though the filters needed to be replaced regularly and replacements were not always available. We were shown how to read the basic warning signs that indicated dangerous radiation levels, though we had no protective equipment against radiation. We were simply expected to work quickly, and hoped the exposure was not immediately lethal. The plasma conduit maintenance tunnels were hell-rendered in metal and heat. They were narrow passages, often requiring crawling or squeezing through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, that ran parallel to the massive conduits themselves. The conduits thrummed with barely contained energy, the air around them shimmering with heat distortion. The metal walls of the tunnels were hot to the touch, even through gloves. Sweat poured from us within minutes of entering the tunnels, and the rebreathers made breathing difficult, each breath tasting of recycled air and rubber seals. My first task was to replace degraded shielding panels on a conduit section in Deck 47. I worked alongside a more experienced servant named Gedrin, who had been aboard for 3 years. He showed me how to use the diagnostic auspex to identify which panels needed replacement, how to carefully remove the old panels without disturbing the conduit itself, and how to install new panels with sealant that would harden under the extreme temperatures. The trick is to work steady, not fast, Gedrin explained, his voice muffled by his rebreather. You rush, you make mistakes. Mistakes here kill you. The conduit does not care about your schedule. It will burn you the same, whether you were careful or careless. We worked for 4 hours before taking a brief rest period. My hands were blistered despite the gloves. My back ached from the awkward positions required in the cramped tunnels, and my head pounded from the heat and the difficulty breathing through the rebreather. Gedrin shared some of his water ration with me, a kindness I would not forget. You did well, he said. Some new servants panic in the tunnels, the heat and the close spaces. It breaks them. They refuse to go back in, and then the overseers have them reassigned to something worse. What could be worse than this? I asked. Gedrin laughed, though there was no humor in it. You really want to know? Waste reclamation crews. They work in the ship's sewage systems, clearing blockages and maintaining the recycling processes. They wade through literal shit for 18 hours at a time. Or cargo handling, moving crates in the holds where they store the truly dangerous items. Xenos artifacts that whisper to you. Warp-touched materials that cause nosebleeds and nightmares. Or the laundry facilities, where they wash the officers' uniforms and the nobles' clothing in water heated to near boiling, working in steam so thick you cannot see your own hands. Burns, scalding, chemical exposure. At least in the tunnels, the death is quick. That first shift stretched into an eternity. 18 hours of crawling through superheated passages, replacing panels, checking seals, confirming that the conduits were operating within acceptable parameters. By the time Horvat finally announced the shift's end, my body was a map of pain. Every muscle ached. My hands were bloody beneath the gloves. My lungs burned from the recycled air. My mind was numb from the constant vigilance required to avoid fatal mistakes. I staggered back to the barracks, collected my ration of corpse starch and water, and collapsed into my hammock. I had 6 hours before the next shift began. I needed to eat, wash the grime from my body, and sleep. There was time for none of it properly, so I did all 3 inadequately and woke to the overseer's whistle, feeling more exhausted than when I had fallen asleep. This was life aboard the Eternal Dividend. This was what they had promised me as opportunity among the stars. During my 2nd week, I witnessed my first death. We were working in a particularly difficult section of conduit where the shielding had catastrophically failed, causing a chain reaction of heat damage to surrounding panels. The entire section needed to be replaced, a job requiring a dozen servants working in coordination. A man named Porvin, who had been aboard for 5 years, was removing a damaged panel when his tool slipped. The panel shifted, and his hand touched the exposed conduit for less than a second. The scream lasted longer than I would have thought possible. His hand was burned away instantly, the flesh vaporizing, and the heat traveled up his arm, cooking the tissue beneath the skin. He fell backward, and others rushed to help him, but there was nothing to be done. The injury was catastrophic. Horvat arrived, assessed the situation, and sent for a chapter serf with medical training. The serf looked at Porvin, who was in shock and still screaming, and shook his head. Too much tissue damage. He will die from the trauma within hours, and we have no resources to save him. Make him comfortable, if you can. They carried Porvin out of the tunnels and laid him in a corner of the work area. His screaming eventually faded to whimpering, then to labored breathing, then to silence. It took 3 hours. We continued working while he died. The shift could not stop for one man's suffering. When he was finally gone, his body was tagged for reclamation and hauled away. A new servant, fresh from another section, was assigned his designation number by the end of the day. That night, Maria found me sitting alone in the barracks, staring at nothing. "Porvin?" she asked. I nodded. He was good at his work, careful, skilled. It did not matter. That is the lesson. You can do everything right and still die because the ship is dangerous and we are expendable. How do you accept this? I asked. How do you wake up every day and go back into those tunnels knowing that today might be the day you slip, or the shielding fails, or the conduit ruptures? Because the alternative is worse, Maria said simply. If I refuse to work, I am punished and then forced to work anyway. If I continue to refuse, I am sent to the tech priests for servitor conversion. At least, if I work and am careful, I have some small control over my survival. It is not much, but it is something. I met others in the section who would become familiar faces in the months ahead. Olin was a former Planetary Defense Force trooper who had been dishonorably discharged for some infraction he never explained and ended up in the recruitment line. He was older, perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone accustomed to military discipline. He understood hierarchy and how to navigate it, which made him valuable to those of us who were still learning. Young Jespa was a cabin attendant, assigned to clean the personal quarters of junior officers. She was only 12 years old, taken from her family because the dynasty needed children small enough to reach into the tight spaces of the upper deck maintenance systems. She had learned quickly that information was currency among the servants. Officers spoke freely in front of servants as if we were furniture, and Jespa listened. She would trade information for favors, an extra ration here, a better hammock assignment there. Even at 12, she was learning to survive through cunning rather than strength. There was a man named Corvin who worked in the laundry facilities and had been aboard for 23 years. His hands were permanently stained with chemicals, his fingers twisted from burns and arthritis. He rarely spoke, but when he did, others listened, because he had survived longer than almost anyone in the lower decks. And there was Sarai, from the recruitment line on Varsavia, who had been assigned to cargo handling. She had lasted 3 weeks before requesting transfer to any other section. Something in the holds had gotten to her. She would not say what, and now she worked in food processing, rendering the corpse starch that we all ate. She told me once, in a moment of dark humor, that the work was easier once you stopped thinking of it as having once been people. The ship itself was a world unto itself. And we learned its rhythms, as one learns the rhythms of nature. The shift changes, the meal periods, the times when the officers conducted inspections and we all worked with extra diligence. The sounds that meant the ship was operating normally and the sounds that meant something was wrong. The vibrations that indicated we were in real space and the subtle wrongness that meant we had translated into the warp. The patterns of the crew's movements, learning which corridors to avoid during certain hours and which sections were safe to pass through without harassment. We learned the unwritten rules that governed servant life. Never make eye contact with officers or nobles. Move quickly, but not so quickly as to appear panicked. Speak only when spoken to, and keep responses brief and respectful. Never question orders, even when the orders were contradictory or impossible. Protect your rations and possessions at all times. Form alliances, but trust slowly. Information is valuable. Share it carefully. Above all, do not attract attention. The servants who lasted longest were those who became invisible, performing their duties efficiently but unremarkably, never giving the overseers reason to notice them either positively or negatively. I learned that my body could adapt to conditions I would have thought unbearable. The heat of the maintenance tunnels became familiar. The pain of blistered hands, a constant companion that I learned to work through. I learned to sleep in short bursts, to eat food that revolted me, to function on minimal water. The human body is remarkably resilient when survival demands it. But I also learned that something else was happening, something more insidious than physical adaptation. My thoughts were beginning to narrow, focusing on immediate concerns rather than larger questions. Where once I would have raged at the injustice of my circumstances, now I simply calculated how to survive the next shift. Where once I would have dreamed of escape or rebellion, now I thought only of getting enough water and finding an empty hammock. The person I had been on Varsavia was being slowly ground away by the mechanical repetition of shipboard life, and I was not certain I had the strength to resist it. The days compressed into an endless cycle of work, brief rest, and work again. Time lost meaning measured in anything but shifts. I stopped counting weeks and began counting in survival increments. Another shift completed without injury. Another meal consumed. Another 6 hours of sleep, stolen from exhaustion. The eternal dividend became my entire universe. Its corridors and compartments the only geography that mattered. Its rhythms the only calendar I knew. The plasma conduit maintenance was soul-destroying in its repetition. Yet each shift brought new dangers that prevented the mind from drifting into complete numbness. A conduit operating within normal parameters could rupture without warning if the shielding had degraded beyond visual detection. A section cleared as safe 1 hour could become lethally radioactive the next if the reactor's output fluctuated. The work required constant vigilance, a state of sustained alertness that exhausted the mind as thoroughly as the physical labor exhausted the body. We crawled through passages so narrow that shoulders scraped against metal walls, heated to temperatures that left burn marks through our coveralls. We worked in sections where the atmosphere was thin, the ship's ventilation systems unable to fully pressurize the deepest maintenance spaces, and every breath felt inadequate. We replaced shielding panels while the conduits they protected thrummed with barely contained plasma, knowing that a catastrophic failure would vaporize us before we could even register the sensation of dying. Gedrin taught me to read the conduits by sound and vibration. Each conduit had its own voice, a particular hum or rattle that indicated its operational state. A smooth, steady tone meant normal function. A fluctuating pitch meant pressure irregularities that required immediate attention. A silence where sound should be meant the conduit had been shut down for maintenance. A rare mercy that allowed us to work without the constant threat of immolation. I learned to place my bare hand against the tunnel wall and feel the vibrations traveling through the metal, detecting problems before the barely functioning Auspex units could register them. The ship speaks if you learn to listen, Gedrin told me during one of our brief rest periods. It all tells you what is happening if you pay attention. The tech priests call it the machine spirit, and they are not entirely wrong. This ship is old, older than the dynasty itself. It has developed patterns, preferences even. Sections that fail more frequently than others. Times when the systems run smoother. You learn these things, or you die ignorant. In my 3rd month aboard, I witnessed a death that would haunt me for years. We were working in a deep section of Deck 52, replacing an entire conduit array that had been damaged during a battle I knew nothing about. The work required us to shut down the conduits completely, drain the plasma, and physically remove the old piping before installing replacements. It was complex work, requiring coordination between multiple teams and the approval of a tech priest to ensure the shutdown would not compromise the ship's power distribution. A servant named Halkor, who had been aboard for 7 years and was considered skilled enough to lead work teams, was overseeing the conduit drain. The plasma was supposed to be rerouted to other sections, the pressure gradually reduced to safe levels before we began disassembly. But someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had made an error. Or perhaps the machine spirit was angry, as Gedren might have said. Or perhaps the eternal dividend simply did not care about the lives of servants. Halcor had just begun to loosen the primary coupling when the conduit ruptured. The plasma had not been fully drained. Pressure remained in the system, trapped by a malfunctioning valve 3 sections away. When the coupling loosened, that pressure found release. The superheated plasma erupted outward in a jet that caught Halcor directly in the chest. He had time to scream, a sound that would replay in my nightmares for months, before the plasma consumed him entirely. The heat was so intense that his body did not burn so much as simply cease to exist, reduced to ash and vapor in the span of seconds. The plasma jet continued for perhaps 10 seconds before the pressure equalized and the flow stopped, leaving only a scorch mark on the tunnel wall where Halcor had stood. The 5 of us who had been working with him stood frozen in shock. Then Horvat's voice crackled over the Vox system installed in the maintenance tunnels. Conduit breach in section 52 Gamma. Casualties. 1 dead. Someone managed to respond. Halcor is gone. Confirmed. Mark the section for tech priest inspection before resuming work. Body recovery unnecessary due to complete disintegration. Continue with current shift assignments. We continued working. What else could we do? Halcor's death was investigated by the tech priests, who determined that a valve failure had caused the accident. The valve was replaced. A new servant was assigned Halcor's designation. The work continued without pause, because the Eternal Dividends operations could not stop for one man's death, or 10, or 100. That night, I asked Maria a question that had been growing in my mind since I arrived aboard. How many servants die each year on this ship? She considered for a long moment before answering. I do not know exactly. The overseers do not share such information with us. But I have been here 11 years, and I have seen perhaps 200 servants die in my various sections and work assignments. Some die from accidents like Halcor. Some die from disease or malnutrition when their bodies simply give out. Some die from exposure to toxins or radiation that kill them slowly over weeks. Some die from void exposure when there are hull breaches. A few die from violence, either punishment or conflicts between servants. 200 in 11 years. That is nearly 20 servants per year just from what you have witnessed directly. And I have not witnessed most deaths aboard. There are thousands of servants on the Eternal Dividend across all sections and decks. If my experience is representative, the annual death toll might be hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 in a bad year. When we see significant combat or travel through particularly dangerous regions of space. The mathematics of exploitation crystallized in my mind. The dynasty recruited servants by the hundreds from every world they visited, replacing the dead and expanding their workforce as needed. The recruitment costs were minimal, just the price of transport and the most basic screening. The maintenance costs were equally minimal, barely enough food and water to sustain life. No medical care beyond what was absolutely necessary to prevent epidemic disease. No safety equipment beyond the bare minimum. When servants died, they were processed through the reclamation systems, their bodies rendered into corpse starch that fed the living servants. Even in death, we were resources to be utilized. The work varied depending on where the ship's needs were most urgent. Sometimes I spent weeks in the plasma conduit tunnels. Other times I was reassigned to different sections, experiencing new varieties of suffering. I spent 10 days working in the laundry facilities, where the household staff's uniforms and the nobles' clothing were washed in massive industrial processes. The water was heated to near boiling to ensure proper sterilization, and the chemicals used to remove stains were caustic enough to burn exposed skin on contact. The facility was filled with constant steam that made breathing difficult and visibility poor. Servants working the laundry developed distinctive injuries. Chemical burns on their hands and forearms. Scalding marks where boiling water splashed. Respiratory problems from inhaling the chemical-laden steam for hours each day. A woman named Kessa worked the laundry for 18 years. Her hands were a horror of scar tissue. The skin thickened and discolored from countless chemical burns. Her lungs wheezed with every breath, damaged by years of inhaling toxic vapors. She moved like an old woman, though she claimed to be only 37 years old. The work had aged her prematurely, stealing decades from her life in exchange for the privilege of continuing to serve. "Why do you stay in the laundry?" I asked her during a meal period. "Could you not request transfer to another section?" "Where would I go?" she replied, her voice raspy. "I know the laundry. I am skilled at it. In another section, I would be new again, unskilled, more likely to make fatal mistakes. Here, at least I know how to survive. The burns and the breathing problems, they kill slowly. A mistake in the plasma tunnels kills instantly. Sometimes slow death is preferable to fast death, when slow death allows you more days of life." I was assigned for a brief, nightmarish period to cargo handling in the lower holds. This was where the rogue traders' acquisitions were stored. Everything from standard trade goods to items of questionable legality and outright heretical nature. The warrant of trade granted House Corvallis broad authority to traffic in materials forbidden to others, and they exercised this authority without apparent restraint. We moved crates and containers whose contents we were forbidden to question. Some were marked with purity seals and warnings in High Gothic. Others were covered in stasis fields that hummed with barely contained energy. A few were inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Xenos glyphs that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. The other servants who worked cargo handling regularly had a particular look in their eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of things witnessed that should not have been seen. They spoke rarely and avoided discussing the cargo. When pressed, one man told me simply, "Do not look at the crates marked with black and yellow. Do not listen if you hear voices coming from sealed containers. Do not touch anything marked with the inquisitorial seal. And if you see something move inside a crate that should be inanimate, report it immediately and distance yourself." I lasted 2 weeks in cargo handling before I requested transfer back to maintenance, accepting the plasma conduit's heat and danger as preferable to the psychological horror of the holds. Something in those depths affected the mind in ways I could not articulate. A wrongness that lingered even after leaving the area. I began having nightmares of alien geometries and whispered voices in languages I should not understand. Only after returning to my regular assignment did the nightmares gradually fade, though they never disappeared entirely. The food processing facilities were perhaps the most soul-destroying assignment, not because of physical danger, but because of what the work represented. This was where the dead were rendered into sustenance for the living, where bodies that had been servants, crew, even enemies killed in battle, were reduced to their component proteins and fats, mixed with synthetic supplements, and reformed into the corpse starch blocks that constituted our rations. Sarai worked food processing, and she had developed a disturbing philosophy to cope with the nature of her work. "We are all the Imperium's resources," she told me once, her voice empty of emotion. "In life, we serve through our labor. In death, we serve by sustaining those who continue to labor. There is efficiency in this. Nothing is wasted. Every atom of our being serves the Emperor's purpose. When I die, I will be processed just as I now process others, and some servant will eat my flesh rendered into paste, and through them I will continue to serve. Is that not a form of immortality?" I found her logic horrifying, yet I could not deny its internal consistency. The Imperium operated on principles of absolute utility. Sentiment and dignity were luxuries reserved for those whose positions granted them such privileges. For the vast masses of humanity, existence was measured purely in functional terms. We were valuable alive because we could work. We remained valuable dead because we could feed those who worked. This was the mathematics of an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, where individual human lives were statistical irrelevancies measured against the species' survival. As the months progressed, I noticed changes in myself that disturbed me more than the physical deterioration. My body was adapting to the harsh conditions, becoming leaner and harder, developing calluses and scar tissue that provided some protection against the daily damages. But my mind was changing in ways I found difficult to articulate. I stopped thinking about Varsavia, except in rare, disconnected moments. The memories were fading, not erased, but losing their emotional weight. My mother's face was becoming indistinct, a blur of features I could no longer quite recall. The Hab block where I had lived my entire life before the ship existed in my memory more as a concept than a place. The specific details dissolving into generic impressions. I was forgetting who I had been, and with that forgetting came a troubling sense of relief. The person I had been would have suffered endlessly aboard the eternal dividend, tormented by the gap between expectation and reality. The person I was becoming accepted this reality as the only reality that mattered. I found myself thinking in terms of shifts and rations rather than days and meals. I measured distances in deck numbers rather than meaningful geography. I referred to myself by my designation more often than my name. And when other servants called me Theta-Seven-Three-Five, I responded automatically, without the internal resistance I had felt initially. I was becoming what the system required me to be, an efficient, unquestioning component in the ship's functioning. Maria noticed this change before I fully recognized it in myself. During a rest period, after a particularly brutal shift in the conduit tunnels, she spoke to me with unusual directness. "You are adapting well. Too well, perhaps. Is that not the goal?" I replied. "There is a difference between adapting to survive and losing yourself entirely. I have seen servants who adapt so completely that they forget they were ever human. They become like the servitors, alive but not truly living, performing their functions without thought or feeling. They survive longer, usually, but at what cost? What alternative exists? To resist adaptation is to suffer endlessly. To maintain connection with who we were before only makes the present more painful." "Perhaps," Maria said quietly, "but I have been aboard 11 years, and I still remember my name. I still remember my daughter, even though I will never see her again. I still feel anger at what has been done to us, even though I am powerless to change it. These things hurt, yes, but they remind me that I am still human, not yet a machine wearing human skin." Her words troubled me because they highlighted a truth I had been avoiding. I was becoming efficient at the cost of my humanity. The person who had boarded the eternal dividend with hope and fear and a full range of human emotions was being systematically dismantled, replaced by something narrower and colder that could function without the burden of feeling. In my 6th month aboard, I received what passed for a promotion. Horvat recognized that I had developed genuine skill in reading the plasma conduits, that my maintenance work was consistently reliable, and that I had survived long enough to be worth investing minor authority in. I was designated a section leader, responsible for overseeing teams of 5 servants during conduit maintenance operations. The promotion came with marginal benefits: a slightly better hammock assignment, an extra half ration of food per day, and the dubious privilege of having other servants' survival dependent on my decisions. It also came with new responsibilities and stresses. When servants under my supervision made mistakes, I was held partially accountable. When work fell behind schedule, I answered to Horvat's displeasure. The marginal improvement in my material conditions was offset by the increased psychological burden. Leading work teams taught me things about human nature I wished I had not learned. Some servants responded to direction with relief, grateful to have someone making decisions so they could simply follow orders. Others resented any authority. even authority as limited as mine, and would undermine instructions out of spite or stubbornness. A few recognized the position as an opportunity, attempting to curry favor or extract advantages through manipulation. I learned to make the cold calculations that the overseers had always made. When a section of conduit was particularly dangerous, I had to decide which servants to send into the worst areas. When someone was injured and we needed to continue working to meet the shift's quotas, I had to decide whether to call for medical assistance or simply work around the wounded until the shift ended. These decisions felt like betrayals of my own humanity, yet they were necessary if I wanted to keep my position and the minor benefits it provided. Olin, the former PDF trooper, offered me advice drawn from his military experience. Command requires distance. You cannot afford to see them as friends or even as people. The moment you do, the decisions become impossible. You must see them as assets to be deployed, just as the officers see us. It is cruel, but it is the only way to function in this role. I tried to follow his advice and found that I could, which horrified me more than if I had failed. I could look at a servant under my supervision and calculate their utility, deciding who to risk and who to protect based purely on their skills and experience. I could hear someone scream in pain and continue directing the work team because stopping would jeopardize the shift's productivity. I was becoming the system I had once hated, perpetuating the same cruelties that had been inflicted upon me. Death became routine. In the 10 months since I had boarded the Eternal Dividend, I had witnessed 43 servants die. Some deaths were spectacular, like Halkor's immolation in the plasma jet. Others were quiet, servants simply collapsing from exhaustion or illness and never rising again. I stopped feeling shock or grief at these deaths. They became data points, problems to be managed. A dead servant meant reassigning work duties and breaking in a replacement. The emotional response had been worn away by repetition until all that remained was the practical consideration of maintaining operational efficiency. This was perhaps the true horror of life aboard the rogue trader's ship. Not the physical dangers or the brutal conditions, as terrible as those were, but the systematic destruction of our capacity to care. We were not broken through sudden violence, but through the slow grinding of routine that made the unbearable into the mundane. The ship did not need to torture us into submission. It simply needed to exhaust us until submission became the path of least resistance. I thought often of Maria's words about maintaining humanity despite adaptation. I tried to hold on to small moments of connection, helping a struggling servant complete their work even when it cost me rest time, sharing water with someone whose ration had been spilled, remembering the names behind the designation numbers. These small acts of resistance against becoming fully mechanical felt simultaneously vital and futile. They changed nothing about our circumstances, yet they were all that remained of the person I had once been. The work continued, endless and grinding, shift after shift after shift, the hours compressing into an undifferentiated mass of heat and exhaustion and danger. This was life aboard the Eternal Dividend. This was what it meant to serve a rogue trader dynasty. We were the invisible machinery that made the glamorous life of exploration and profit possible, burning ourselves out in darkness so that others might sail among the stars in light. In my 8th month aboard, the overseers selected me for temporary reassignment to the upper decks. A minor household staff shortage, caused by 3 servants being executed for theft, required filling positions immediately. I was chosen because my promotion to section leader indicated reliability, and because I had avoided disciplinary incidents. The assignment was temporary, perhaps 2 weeks, after which I would return to maintenance. I had no idea this brief glimpse into the dynasty's world would fundamentally alter my understanding of my own circumstances. The transition began at the boundary between the lower and upper decks, a checkpoint guarded by armsmen in House Corvallis livery. They inspected us thoroughly, checking for weapons, contraband, signs of disease or disfigurement that might offend noble sensibilities. We were issued clean uniforms, better quality than our standard coveralls, and given explicit instructions about conduct in the presence of the dynasty and their guests. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact. If a noble addresses you, you respond with, "Yes, my lord," or "Yes, my lady," regardless of the question. You are furniture with the capacity to follow orders. Any deviation from these rules will result in immediate return to the lower decks and disciplinary action. Clear? We confirmed understanding and were escorted upward through sections of the ship I had never seen. The change was immediate and shocking. Where the lower decks were bare metal, rust, and functional ugliness, the upper decks were decorated with obsessive attention to aesthetic detail. The corridors were wide, their walls covered in wood paneling that must have been imported at extraordinary cost. Paintings hung in gilded frames, depicting House Corvallis's glories across the millennia. Sculptures stood in alcoves, some devotional representations of the emperor, others depicting the dynasty's founder and notable ancestors. The lighting was soft and warm rather than harsh industrial white. The air smelled clean, filtered and scented with incense that masked any hint of the ship's mechanical odors. We passed crew members who wore crisp uniforms without visible wear or staining. We saw chapter serfs who carried themselves with dignity rather than the hunched exhaustion of lower deck servants. And we saw, for the first time, servitors of a different class, ones whose human components had been preserved and augmented with obvious care. Their mechanical parts polished chrome rather than corroded iron. Their programming sophisticated enough to perform complex tasks rather than simple repetitive labor. The household staff quarters where we would be temporarily housed were modest by upper deck standards but luxurious compared to what we had known. Individual rooms, small but private, each with an actual bed rather than a hammock. A locker large enough to store multiple changes of clothing. A personal washing basin with running water. The shock of privacy, of being able to close a door and be alone, was almost overwhelming. We were assigned to different duties across the upper decks. I was placed under the supervision of head butler Commodore, a man who had served House Corvallis for 43 years, beginning as a general, menial, and rising through decades of perfect service to the highest position a servant could achieve. He was elderly, perhaps 70, his body thin and bent, but his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried absolute authority over the household staff. "You will attend the informal dining salon," Commodore instructed me. His voice clipped and precise. "Your duties are to stand ready to fulfill any request from the diners, to keep their glasses filled, to remove dishes as they are finished, and to remain utterly invisible unless called upon. The Lord Captain dines at the 18th hour with his family, and occasionally with guests. You will arrive 1 hour early to assist with preparations, and will remain until dismissed. Questions? No, sir. Good. One additional instruction. You may witness conversations that touch upon the dynasty's business. You may see xenos, guests, or individuals whose presence aboard might seem unusual. You will remember nothing. You will repeat nothing. The household staff who last violated this confidence had their tongues removed before being converted to servitors. Learn from their example. The informal dining salon was larger than the entire servant barracks in Deck 47. The ceiling soared 3 meters overhead, painted with a mural depicting House Corvallis's expeditions into the Coronis expanse. Crystal chandeliers provided illumination that could be adjusted to match the time of day on any civilized world. The dining table was carved from a single piece of dark wood and could seat 30 comfortably. The chairs were upholstered in fabric softer than anything I had touched in my life. Paintings of past Lord Captains watched from the walls with stern expressions. The preparations were elaborate. The table had to be set with specific silverware, multiple forks and knives whose purposes I could not fathom, crystal glasses of different shapes for different beverages, plates of actual porcelain rather than the metal trays we used in the servant mess. napkins of real cloth, folded into decorative shapes, every element positioned with geometric precision, measured with rulers to ensure perfect spacing. When Lord Captain Hadrian Corvallis entered the salon, I understood for the first time the vast gulf between my existence and his. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a coat of deep blue fabric embroidered with silver thread in intricate patterns. His hair was gray but full, swept back from a face that showed his age through distinguished lines rather than haggard exhaustion. He moved with casual confidence, a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. Behind him came Lady Corvallis, his wife, wearing a gown that probably cost more than the yearly operational budget for my entire maintenance section. Their 3 adult children followed, along with several guests whose dress marked them as lesser nobility or wealthy merchants. They spoke as they took their seats. Casual conversation about trade negotiations, political developments in the subsector, the quality of wines from a particular world. Their words were meaningless to me, references to places and people I had never heard of. But the tone was what struck me most. They sounded bored. These were people for whom exotic travel across the stars, dealings with alien species, the accumulation of wealth beyond measure, were routine. Nothing excited them because everything was available to them. The meal service began, and I saw food I had not imagined existed. Not corpse starch, but actual prepared dishes made from real ingredients. Grilled meat from some animal raised for consumption. Vegetables that had been grown in the ship's hydroponics bays, reserved entirely for the nobles. Sauces and seasonings that transformed ingredients into art. Bread made from real grain rather than recycled proteins. Desserts crafted from sugar and cream, and fruits imported from distant worlds. I stood against the wall with 3 other servants, ready to respond to any gesture or request. We were required to anticipate needs before they were voiced. An empty glass had to be refilled before the diner noticed it was empty. A finished course had to be removed at the precise moment when continuing to leave it would be intrusive, but removing it earlier would be presumptuous. It was exhausting work of a completely different nature than the physical labor of the lower decks. This was psychological and social exhaustion, the constant vigilance required to be simultaneously present and invisible. The conversations I overheard were illuminating in ways I had not expected. Lord Captain Corvallis discussed profit margins on a recent trade expedition with the casualness of someone commenting on weather. The numbers he mentioned represented more wealth than everyone in my home habblock on Varsavia would earn in their combined lifetimes. A single successful trade run generated millions of thrones in profit for the dynasty, and he spoke of it as merely satisfactory, not exceptional. His eldest son, Tertius, complained about the quality of the Xenos artifacts recovered from a recently explored system. The Eldar craftwork was inferior. Father, barely worth the risk of dealing with their merchants. We should have pushed further into the expanse rather than wasting time on that system. Patience, Hadrian replied, cutting a piece of meat with movements so casual they seemed choreographed. Not every expedition yields treasures. The aggregate profit across our ventures is what matters. A disappointing haul is acceptable when balanced against our recent successes. Lady Corvallis asked about crew casualties from a recent engagement with pirates. The Seneschal, Arcturus Venn, who had joined them for dinner, consulted a data slate and reported 16 crew dead, 43 injured, extensive damage to the portside weapons batteries. Acceptable losses, Hadrian said without emotion. The cargo we were defending was worth substantially more than the repair costs. Have the families of the dead been compensated, according to contract? Yes, my lord. Standard death benefits have been distributed. Good. Maintaining crew morale requires honoring such obligations. What of the servants lost during the engagement? 27 dead from void exposure when the hull was breached in sections 40 through 45. 13 injured. 3 of whom required processing for servitor conversion due to the severity of injuries. Replace them at the next recruitment opportunity. Make a note that sections 40 through 45 will require additional servants during combat situations, as those areas are apparently vulnerable to breaching. They discussed my fellow servants' deaths the way one might discuss replacing broken tools. There was no malice in their voices, no cruelty, simply complete indifference. We were line items in ledgers, resources to be managed with the same consideration given to ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. The contrast between what I was witnessing and what I had experienced in the lower decks was impossible to fully process. A single meal at this table wasted more food than a servant's monthly ration. The wine they sipped casually and sometimes left unfinished in their glasses cost more than I would earn in a year if servants were actually paid wages. Lady Corvallis complained that the fabric of her gown was slightly less soft than she preferred, wearing something that could have purchased food for 100 servants for a month. Yet this was not exceptional cruelty or unusual decadence. This was simply how rogue trader dynasties lived. The warrant of trade granted them authority to travel beyond the Imperium's borders, to trade with Xeno species, to claim entire worlds in the Emperor's name, and the wealth generated by these activities was theirs to enjoy. They were nobility, elevated above common humanity by ancient charter and accumulated power. That servants died in darkness so they might dine in splendor was not a moral question, but simply the natural order of the Imperium's hierarchy. Over the following days, I witnessed more of the dynasty's life and learned more than I wanted to know about the ship's actual operations. The Eternal Dividend was not primarily an exploration vessel. It was a mobile trading empire, traveling the Coronis expanse and beyond, purchasing goods cheaply or stealing them outright, then selling them for enormous profit to markets throughout the Imperium. The dynasty dealt in everything: standard commodities like ore and manufactured goods, exotic materials from alien worlds, ancient technologies recovered from dead civilizations, even human cargo in the form of indentured populations sold as labor to colony worlds. I attended a business meeting in Lord Captain Corvallis's private study, where he received a delegation of merchants from a trading consortium. The negotiations involved the sale of an entire population, 17,000 men, women, and children, from a world that had failed to meet its tithe obligations and been declared in rebellion. The Imperium's forces had conquered the world, and the population was being sold to offset the costs of the military campaign. House Corvallis was purchasing them for resale to an agri-world that needed laborers for its massive crop installations. The price negotiated was 12 thrones per person, a number that seemed impossibly small until I understood the scale. 17,000 people at 12 thrones, each generated over 200,000 thrones in gross revenue. After transport costs and bribes to various officials, the dynasty would net perhaps 150,000 thrones profit. This was considered a minor deal, barely worth the Lord Captain's personal attention, but he attended because the trading consortium represented opportunities for future, more lucrative arrangements. Listening to human lives reduced to financial calculations made something cold settle in my chest. I was one of those human resources, valued only for my utility, and if I became more profitable as cargo than as crew, the dynasty would sell me without hesitation. The household staff themselves represented a different facet of the hierarchy's cruelty. They were better fed, better housed, better treated than general servants, and they protected their positions with vicious dedication. Commodore ruled the household staff with absolute authority, enforcing standards of service that were simultaneously arbitrary and inflexible. A glass placed 3 centimeters out of alignment was cause for punishment. A servant who made eye contact with a noble, even accidentally, was immediately dismissed back to the lower decks. The personal attendants to the family members existed in constant anxiety. Lady Corvallis's primary attendant, a woman named Thessaly who had served for 16 years, lived in terror of displeasing her mistress. A poorly drawn bath, a dress that wrinkled during storage, a hairstyle that did not meet expectations. Any of these could result in dismissal or worse. Yet Thessaly was viciously competitive with other attendants, undermining them when possible, reporting their mistakes to Commodore, positioning herself as indispensable through the destruction of potential rivals. I witnessed an attendant named Pyrrhus accused of stealing a minor piece of jewelry that had actually been misplaced by the noble he served. Despite his protests of innocence, despite the item being found later exactly where the noble had left it, Pyrrhus was punished as an example. They beat him in front of the assembled household staff, then sent him to the lower decks with a notation in his record that would ensure he never rose above general menial status again. The noble who had made the false accusation never apologized or acknowledged the error. Why would he? Servants were beneath consideration. The system perpetuated itself through those who benefited marginally from it. Commodore had been a general menial once, suffering in the lower decks as I suffered now. Rather than feel solidarity with those in his former position, he had internalized the hierarchy's values and enforced them even more harshly than the nobles themselves. He was living proof that elevation was possible, which made him a more effective enforcer than any almsman. He showed us what we could become if we served with perfect obedience for decades, and what we would become was a reflection of everything we hated. I met a personal servant named Corax, who attended Tertius Corvallis, the eldest son. Corax was unusual in that he retained some capacity for reflection despite his position. During a brief moment when we were both performing duties in the same corridor, he spoke to me, quietly. "You are from the lower decks, yes? Temporarily assigned?" "Yes. I work plasma conduit maintenance normally. Do you think the nobility cruel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think they are indifferent, which is worse than cruelty. You understand then. They are not evil. They are simply functioning within a system that elevates them to heights where we become invisible. Master Tertius is not a bad man by his own standards. He is generous to those he considers people, loyal to his family, faithful to the Emperor. But I am not a person to him. I am a function. When I perform my duties well, he is pleased the way one is pleased when a machine operates correctly. When I fail, he is annoyed the way one is annoyed when a machine malfunctions. There is no malice, no recognition that I suffer or hope or fear. I simply am not real to him in any meaningful way." His words captured something I had been struggling to articulate. The horror was not that the dynasty was exceptionally evil, but that they were entirely ordinary by the Imperium's standards. Every rogue trader dynasty operated this way. Every noble house, every military command, every level of the Imperium's vast hierarchy maintained itself through the same mathematics of exploitation. The suffering of those below was not a flaw in the system, but its fundamental operating principle. On my 8th day in the upper decks, I witnessed something that would haunt me for years. Lord Captain Corvallis was conducting a tour for visitors, wealthy merchants considering investing in one of his expeditions. He showed them through various sections of the ship, displaying its capabilities and discussing potential profit margins. The tour route happened to pass through a junction where a sealed access way led to the lower decks. One of the merchants, curious about the ship's layout, asked what lay beyond the sealed door. Hadrian explained that it led to the servant quarters and maintenance sections, areas unnecessary for their understanding of the ship's operational capacity. The merchant persisted, expressing interest in seeing how the lower decks functioned. Hadrian, indulging his potential investors' curiosity, ordered the door unsealed. I was part of the attending staff for the tour and followed as they descended several levels. The change was immediate. The paneled corridors gave way to bare metal. The clean air became thick with oil and human odors. The soft lighting became harsh, industrial illumination. We passed through sections where servants were working, their bodies filthy and exhausted, performing the same brutal labor I knew intimately. The merchants reacted with visible distaste, covering their noses against the smell, commenting quietly about the conditions. But what struck me most was Hadrian's expression, or rather his lack of expression. He showed them through these areas with the same casual demeanor he might display when showing off a new cargo hold or weapon system. This was simply another aspect of his ship's operations, neither shameful nor concerning. The servants are housed in communal barracks with appropriately efficient space allocation, he explained. They work 18-hour shifts, maintaining systems too menial or dangerous for trained crew. Attrition averages approximately 15% annually, well within acceptable parameters given recruitment costs. The lower decks operate under separate environmental controls to optimize resource distribution, prioritizing crew comfort while maintaining servant functionality. He described our suffering in the language of efficiency and logistics, and the merchants nodded their understanding. This was good business practice. Why waste resources on servants when minimal investment kept them functional? Why provide better conditions when servants could be easily replaced? The mathematics were clear, and morality was irrelevant to mathematics. As we returned to the upper decks, one merchant commented to Hadrian, "Your operational efficiency is impressive, Lord Captain. Many dynasties waste resources on unnecessary servant comforts. Your approach is admirably pragmatic." Hadrian accepted the compliment with a modest nod. "The warrant of trade grants us authority, but success requires discipline. Every throne spent unwisely is a throne stolen from the dynasty's future. Our ancestors built this empire through careful resource management. We honor them by maintaining the same principles." I understood then that no individual cruelty or personal evil maintained our suffering. It was the simple logic of profit maximization applied across every decision. The dynasty was not exceptionally cruel, they were exceptionally efficient, and our suffering was a natural consequence of that efficiency. My 2 weeks in the upper decks ended, and I was returned to maintenance section Theta-7. The transition back was jarring. The privacy of the household quarters disappeared, replaced by the communal barracks. The real food disappeared, replaced by corpse starch. The relative dignity of household service disappeared, replaced by the brutal labor of the plasma conduits. Yet I found the return almost comforting. At least in the lower decks, the reality of my position was honest. I was not required to pretend service was anything but suffering. Maria noticed I had changed. "The upper decks affected you," she said. "I saw how they live. I saw what they think of us. Which is nothing. They think nothing of us. We do not exist in their moral universe. And this surprises you?" "No. But understanding something intellectually and witnessing it directly are different experiences. I knew we were exploited. Now I understand the complete indifference behind that exploitation. We are being crushed, not by malice but by mathematics, and somehow that is worse." In my 10th month aboard the Eternal Dividend, we prepared for warp translation. I had experienced 3 warp journeys already, but each time the dread was fresh, undiminished by familiarity. The ship's senior staff understood what we would face better than we did, and their preparations spoke volumes about the horror awaiting us. The announcement came through the Vox system 3 days before translation. All servants will secure their sections and prepare for warp transit. Standard protocols will be observed. The Emperor protects. Standard protocols meant different things for crew and servants. Crew members were issued additional rations, granted rest periods before the journey, and provided with mild sedatives to ease the psychological strain. Servitors were powered down entirely when possible, their simple minds unable to withstand even the filtered touch of the warp. Servants received none of these considerations. We were given our regular rations, worked our regular shifts until the moment of translation, and were issued a single, small pill that Maria told me was a mild psychotropic designed to dull our perception without rendering us unconscious. "Take it just before translation," she advised, pressing the pill into my palm. "It will not protect you entirely, but it helps. Some servants refuse to take it, thinking they can endure with pure faith. Those servants tend to die or go mad. The warp does not care about faith, and neither does the pill. But at least the pill offers something. The lower deck servants who had experienced multiple warp journeys all bore psychological scars. A man named Varric had a constant tremor in his hands, remnant of a particularly difficult translation where the Geller field had flickered. A woman named Solus refused to sleep with the lights fully dimmed, claiming that darkness allowed things to creep closer. Gedron, my mentor in the plasma conduits, had developed a habit of constantly counting under his breath. A ritual, he claimed, helped him maintain his sense of reality. The warp is not like real space, Gedron told me during our final shift before translation. Physics becomes optional. Time stops being linear. Your senses will report impossible things, and your mind will struggle to process information that violates every rule of existence you have ever known. The Geller field protects us, creates a bubble of reality within the immaterium's chaos. But it is not perfect. Things bleed through. Sensations, impressions, sometimes worse. The tech priests maintain the field, pray to the machine spirits, perform rituals to strengthen the barrier. But we are servants. We occupy the outermost sections, the spaces closest to the hull, where the Geller field is weakest. If anything breaches, it breaches where we live. The hours before translation were marked by unusual activity throughout the ship. Tech priests moved through every section, inscribing protective wards on bulkheads, anointing machinery with sacred oils, chanting litanies to the Emperor and the Omnissiah. Servitors carried incense burners, filling corridors with smoke that was supposed to repel demonic attention. The ship's priest, a stern man named Confessor Malthus, led prayer sessions for crew and servants alike, reminding us that faith was our shield against the warp's corruption. I attended one of these prayer sessions in a makeshift chapel near the servant barracks. 200 servants packed into a space meant for 50, kneeling on the cold metal floor, while Malthus stood before an altar bearing the Aquila and spoke of the Emperor's protection. "You will face the warp, and the warp will test you," he intoned, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You will see things that should not exist. You will hear voices that speak in languages you should not understand. You will feel presences that defy the laws of reality. These are lies. The warp is the realm of chaos, and chaos is the great deceiver. Everything you experience there is false, designed to corrupt and destroy. Your faith is your armor. When the darkness presses close, recite the Emperor's prayers. When voices call to you, speak only the liturgies of purity. When you see impossible things, close your eyes and trust in his divine protection." His words should have been comforting, but they contained an implicit admission. The warp would affect us. Faith would not fully protect us, and some of us would not survive. The prayer session ended with the recitation of the litany against fear. Hundreds of voices joining in the familiar words. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. The words felt hollow against what was coming, but we spoke them anyway. Translation occurred during what should have been sleep cycle, though few servants were actually sleeping. The ship's navigator, a sanctioned mutant who dwelt in isolation in the navigator's spire, began the process of piercing the barrier between real space and the immaterium. I felt it before any announcement was made. A subtle wrongness that started in my bones and spread outward. The ship's vibrations changed, taking on a quality that was not quite sound and not quite sensation, something between the two that made teeth ache and skin crawl. The lights throughout the lower decks flickered once, twice, then stabilized at a dimmer level than normal. The temperature dropped noticeably, breath becoming visible in the cold air despite the environmental systems supposedly maintaining constant conditions. And then came the nausea, a deep, visceral wrongness as reality itself bent around us, and the eternal dividend entered the warp. The transition was not instantaneous. It stretched across several seconds that felt like hours, the ship shuddering and groaning as it pushed through the barrier between dimensions. Metal screamed. The air pressure fluctuated wildly, ears popping painfully, and beneath it all was a sensation I could not adequately describe, like the universe was turning inside out and taking me with it. Then it was done, and we were in the warp. The immediate physical symptoms subsided, replaced by something worse. A constant background wrongness that pervaded every sensation. The ship's normal sounds continued, the hum of machinery, the distant thrum of the plasma conduits, but underneath them were other sounds that should not exist, whispers in languages I did not know, laughter that came from no source. A low moaning that might have been wind but could not be, because there was no wind inside a ship. I took the pill Maria had given me, swallowing it dry because I did not trust myself to keep water down. The effect was subtle, a slight dulling of perception, emotions becoming distant and manageable. It did not stop me from experiencing the warp's effects, but it created a psychological buffer, a thin layer of chemical protection between my consciousness and the raw horror pressing against the hull. The first day in the warp was the most difficult because the mind still expected reality to follow familiar rules. Shadows fell in wrong directions, pointing away from light sources rather than away from them. Objects seemed to shift position when not directly observed. A hammer left on a workbench, migrating several centimeters by the time you looked back. Colors were subtly wrong, reds too intense, blues too deep, greens that hurt to look at directly. The temperature continued to fluctuate randomly, freezing cold one moment, stifling heat the next, without any correlation to the environmental systems. Time became unreliable. I would begin a task, work on it for what felt like an hour, and discover only 10 minutes had passed according to the chronometer. Other times, a simple action like walking down a corridor consumed time disproportionate to the distance traveled. The ship's bells marking shift changes rang at intervals that felt irregular, though they insisted the timing remained constant. Sleep became nearly impossible. The hammock swayed with movements that were not my own. The darkness was full of shapes that dissolved when focused on, peripheral vision constantly catching motion that was not there when examined directly. The other servants around me moved and muttered in their sleep, but their movements seemed wrong, limbs bending at angles that did not quite match human anatomy, faces obscured by shadows too deep to be natural. I gave up trying to sleep properly and instead drifted in and out of a twilight state. Never fully conscious but never fully unconscious, aware of the passage of time but unable to track it coherently. In this state, I experienced what might have been dreams or might have been something worse. I saw my mother standing at the end of my hammock, but her face was wrong. Features too sharp, eyes too large, mouth moving in words I could not hear. I saw Maria sitting beside me, except there were 3 of her, slightly out of phase, each one speaking different words simultaneously. I saw corridors stretching infinitely in both directions, servants walking along them in endless procession, their bodies translucent and unreal. The warp affected different people in different ways. Some servants became almost catatonic, going through their work duties mechanically, while their minds retreated inward. Others became hyperactive, talking constantly, moving without purpose, their thoughts racing too fast for coherent communication. A few experienced the opposite of what I felt, time slowing to a crawl where every second stretched into subjective hours, trapped in an extended present that never progressed. Maria maintained better than most, her 11 years of experience having taught her coping mechanisms. She spent much of the warp journey in constant motion, working when there was work to be done and walking the corridors when there was not, her lips moving in continuous prayer. Motion helps, she told me during one of our infrequent conversations. If you stay still, you start to feel the warp pressing closer. Movement makes you harder to pin down. Or at least, that is what I tell myself. The work continued despite the warp transit because the ship's systems still required maintenance. Plasma conduits still needed monitoring, waste systems still needed clearing. The endless tasks of keeping a vessel operational did not pause for cosmic horror. But the work became significantly more dangerous during warp travel. The machinery developed strange behaviors. Conduits that had operated smoothly in real space began to fluctuate wildly, pressure and temperature varying unpredictably. Tools malfunctioned, diagnostic equipment returned nonsensical readings, and the machine spirits seemed agitated in ways the tech priests could not fully calm. We worked with extreme caution, triple-checking every action, because a mistake that might merely injure in real space could kill in ways that violated natural law while in the warp. On the third day of warp transit, or what I believed was the third day, though time had become unreliable, I experienced the voices for the first time. I was working in a plasma conduit tunnel, alone because servant pairing was considered inefficient use of resources, when I heard someone speaking behind me. The voice was clear and distinct, speaking my name, my real name, not my designation. "Kael," it said, the tone intimate and familiar. "Kael, why are you crawling through these tunnels? This is not what you were meant for." I turned, knowing with absolute certainty that no one was there, but compelled to look anyway. Yet the voice continued, seeming to come from inside my head now, rather than from an external source. "You could be more than this. You have skills, intelligence, potential wasted on menial labor. The dynasty does not appreciate you. They use you until you break and then discard you. But there are powers that would value what you are. Powers that would elevate you, give you the strength to take what you deserve, rather than beg for scraps." I recognized this for what it was. The warp was probing, seeking cracks in my psychological defenses, offering temptations tailored to my specific desires and resentments. I began reciting the litany against corruption, speaking the words aloud to drown out the internal voice. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Blessed is the mind that contemplates only duty. I am a servant of the God Emperor. I reject the lies of chaos. I embrace only the truth of his divine will." The voice laughed, a sound without humor. "You recite words taught by those who exploit you. You pray to a corpse god who never answers. But continue your prayers if they comfort you. They will not save you when the darkness comes." Then it was gone, and I was alone in the tunnel with only the conduit's hum and my own ragged breathing. I reported the incident to Horvat, as we had been instructed to report any unusual experiences. He noted it in his log without apparent concern. "Voices are common during warp transit. Continue your work. If you begin to hear specific instructions, or if the voices claim to be the Emperor himself, report immediately for observation. Otherwise, ignore them and maintain your duties." The casualness with which he dismissed my experience was almost more disturbing than the voices themselves. This was so routine, so expected, that it did not warrant concern. We were all being touched by the warp, and as long as we did not succumb entirely, we were considered functional. Other servants reported similar experiences. Visions of dead loved ones, promises of power or escape, accusations of sins real and imagined, whispered by voices that knew intimate details of their lives. The warp was intelligent in its corruption, or the entities within it were, targeting each person's specific vulnerabilities with precision that suggested malevolent intent. On what I believed was the 5th day, though the chronometers insisted it was only the 4th, the Geller field flickered. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, a brief weakening of the protective barrier that allowed the full reality of the warp to touch the ship directly. Those 3 seconds would haunt my nightmares forever after. The lights went out completely. Not dimmed, not reduced, but utterly extinguished, leaving darkness more absolute than any natural absence of light. In that darkness, I could see things that should not be visible. Shapes that moved with impossible geometry, existing in more dimensions than three. Colors that had no name because they existed outside the visible spectrum. Eyes, countless eyes, opening in the darkness and focusing on us with attention that felt like physical weight. Sound became visual, light became tactile, all senses mixing and inverting until I could not distinguish between them. I tasted the screaming of other servants. I heard the color red. I felt time flowing backward and forward simultaneously. My body existed in multiple states at once, young and old, alive and dead, human and something other. And through it all came a presence, something vast and terrible and infinitely amused by our suffering. It spoke without words, communicated through pure emotion, and what it communicated was contempt. We were insects, less than insects, briefly noticed and immediately forgotten by something so far beyond human comprehension that our very existence was a cosmic joke. Then the Gela field stabilized, and reality returned with jarring abruptness. The lights came back on. The sensory confusion resolved. I was lying on the floor of the barracks, though I did not remember returning there from the maintenance tunnels. Other servants were scattered around the compartment in similar states of confusion and distress. Some were weeping, others stared blankly at nothing. A few were screaming, unable to stop even when their voices gave out and only hoarse rasping continued. Horvat and other overseers moved through the compartment, assessing damage. 3 servants had died during the flicker, their hearts simply stopping from the shock of unfiltered warp exposure. 2 more had gone irreversibly insane, their minds broken by what they had experienced. These were dragged away, destination unknown, but probably the tech priest's workshops for servitor conversion. One servant, a man named Kael, who had been aboard for 6 years, had been possessed during the flicker. He stood in the center of the barracks, his body moving in ways that violated its skeletal structure, his face twisted into expressions that shifted too rapidly to follow. His voice, when he spoke, contained multiple tones simultaneously, creating harmonics that hurt to hear. "This vessel swims through our realm," the thing, wearing Kael, said, addressing us with eyes that were no longer human. "You think yourselves protected by faith and iron, but you are naked before us, exposed and vulnerable. We taste your fear. It is delicious. We will feast again when the barriers fail, and fail they will. For nothing lasts forever in the face of eternity." The armsmen arrived with flamers and incinerators. They did not attempt exorcism or salvation. Kael was beyond help, his body merely a vessel for something that should not exist in real space. They burned him where he stood, the possessed servant laughing even as his flesh blackened and peeled away. The laughter continuing until the vocal cords were destroyed, and only the crackle of flames remained. The smell of burning human flesh filled the barracks. We were not given time to process what had happened. Shift change came, and those assigned to work were sent to their duties. The dead were processed for reclamation. The insane were taken away. Life aboard the Eternal Dividend continued because stopping was not an option, not in the warp where time and distance meant nothing and the only safety lay in reaching our destination. The navigator, whose name I did not know and would never learn, was navigating us through the immaterium toward whatever distant system was our destination. They were withstanding the full force of the warp's assault on their psyche, their mutant third eye perceiving the currents and eddies of the warp, guiding us through madness toward our goal. If they faltered, if they lost their way or succumbed to the warp's temptations, we would be lost forever, drifting through chaos until the ship itself succumbed. I understood then the terrible burden carried by navigators and why they were simultaneously revered and isolated. They were mutants, abhumans tolerated only because their gift was essential to warp travel. They lived in sealed chambers, seeing no one except their most trusted servants. Their third eye covered always, except when navigating. They experienced the warp more intensely than anyone else aboard, and it destroyed them slowly, each journey taking a psychological toll that accumulated over their lifetimes. Many went mad. Some succumbed to possession. All died young by normal human standards, burned out by the terrible strain of their duty. We were told the journey would last approximately 12 days ship time, though such measurements meant little in the warp. Time passed differently there, sometimes faster than real space, sometimes slower, occasionally not at all. A journey of 12 days might subjectively feel like weeks or mere hours to those experiencing it. We marked time by shift changes and meal periods. But even these became unreliable as exhaustion and psychological strain accumulated. By what I believed was the 8th day, I had stopped trusting my own perceptions entirely. I saw Maria have 3 different conversations with me that she later denied having occurred. I found myself in sections of the ship I had no memory of traveling to. I completed work assignments that had already been completed or never needed doing in the first place. Reality had become so unstable that separating genuine experience from hallucination was impossible. The only anchor was routine. Work, eat, attempt, sleep, repeat. The mechanical rhythm of duties provided structure when everything else dissolved into chaos. I clung to that routine desperately, using it to maintain some sense of continuity even when I could no longer trust my memories or senses. The final days of the journey brought no relief, only accumulated exhaustion and the desperate hope that emergence into real space would come soon. Every servant bore visible signs of the strain. Eyes haunted and hollow, movements jerky and uncertain, speech fragmented and confused. We were all damaged by the experience, some more than others, but none of us untouched. When translation back to real space finally came, the relief was so intense it was almost painful. Reality reasserted itself with the same jarring force as the initial translation, but this time the wrongness flowed away rather than pressing in. The ship shuddered, the lights stabilized, and suddenly physics worked properly again. Shadows fell in correct directions, colors returned to normal, time resumed its linear progression. The whispers and wrongness faded to memory. I lay in my hammock, feeling sensations return to normal, and wept with relief. Around me, other servants were doing the same, or laughing hysterically, or simply lying still and experiencing the mercy of a reality that followed comprehensible rules. We had survived. Not all of us, but enough of us. 14 servants dead from various causes during the 12-day journey. 7 driven permanently insane and sent for servitor conversion. Countless others psychologically scarred in ways that would never fully heal. And we would do this again and again, as often as the ship's business required warp travel. There was no immunity from the warp's touch, no adaptation that made subsequent journeys easier. Each time we would face the same horror, the same assault on sanity and reality. This was the price of traveling among the stars. This was what it meant to serve aboard a ship that sailed the immaterium. Maria found me as we returned to our duties, back in the maintenance tunnels, where at least the heat and danger followed predictable rules. She looked as exhausted as I felt, her face gaunt, her hands trembling slightly with residual stress. "You survived your first long warp journey," she said. "They say the first is the worst because you do not know what to expect. But that is a lie. Every journey is the worst. You simply learn to accept that it will be terrible and survive anyway." "How many more times?" I asked. "How many more warp journeys before the accumulated damage breaks me?" "I have survived 17, she replied. "And I will survive 18 and 19 and however many more until I die or go mad. Because the alternative is to refuse. And refusal means death or servitor conversion. We endure because enduring is all we can do. The plasma conduits were almost comforting in their familiar danger. At least they would kill quickly, with fire and heat that obeyed physical laws. The warp killed slowly, eroding sanity and self until nothing recognizably human remained. I had survived, but something had been taken from me during those 12 days. A piece of my mind, a fragment of my sanity, gone forever into the madness of the immaterium. And I knew with absolute certainty that with each subsequent journey, more pieces would be stolen until eventually there would not be enough left to constitute a person. This was life aboard a rogue trader's vessel. This was the price servants paid so that the dynasty could pursue profit across the stars. We burned ourselves out in darkness and madness so they could accumulate wealth beyond measure. And the Imperium called this holy service, blessed duty, in the Emperor's name. The warp had taught me one truth beyond all doubt. We were already in hell, and there was no escape. In my 14th month aboard the Eternal Dividend, we arrived at Cyprian's Gate, a prosperous trade world in the Calixis sector. The announcement came during morning meal cycle. Selected servants would be granted shore leave, 18 hours on the planetary surface before mandatory return. The news spread through the lower decks, with a mixture of desperate hope and suspicious caution. Shore leave was technically permitted by imperial regulations governing servant treatment, but actual implementation was rare and carried implications we all understood. The overseers selected 100 servants from across all sections, chosen apparently at random, though I suspected calculations of productivity and loyalty influenced the selection. I was among them, along with Maria, which surprised me until I realized she had never been granted shore leave in her 11 years aboard. The designation was simultaneously privilege and test. Horvat assembled us in the work bay and delivered instructions with his characteristic emotionless efficiency. You will have 18 hours planetside. You will remain in designated servant zones within the port district. You will not attempt to contact local authorities or seek employment elsewhere. You will conduct yourselves in a manner befitting representatives of House Corvallis. Failure to return within the allotted time will result in consequences not only for the absent individual but for randomly selected servants from their section. This is collective responsibility. Your actions affect others. Remember this. The implicit threat was clear. Desertion was not impossible, but its cost would be paid by innocent servants who remained behind. The dynasty did not need to guard us closely if we would guard each other through the bonds of shared suffering and collective punishment. We were issued clean uniforms, better quality than our work coveralls, and given small allowances of currency, 3 throne gelt each. Barely enough to purchase a meal, but sufficient to give the illusion of economic agency. The branding on my left forearm, the House Corvallis mark, would identify me to any authorities as bonded servant property, but technically I was free to move within designated areas. The shuttle ride to the surface was markedly different from the terror of my initial recruitment. This time, I could look through the viewports and actually process what I was seeing. Cyprian's Gate was a civilized world, not a hive-choked industrial nightmare like Varsavia. From orbit, I could see green spaces, actual forests, and agricultural regions. The cities were planned and structured rather than sprawling cancerous growths. The sky was blue, a color I had almost forgotten existed naturally. The descent was smooth, professional. The pilot, navigating through traffic control patterns with practiced ease. We landed at a commercial port district, a sprawling complex of warehouses, trading houses, and support infrastructure that serviced the hundreds of vessels visiting the system. The landing pad was surrounded by similar facilities, ships from a dozen different dynasties and trading concerns, all engaged in the complex business of interstellar commerce. When the shuttle ramp descended and I stepped onto the surface, the sensation was overwhelming. Real gravity, not the artificial gravity of the ship's deck plates, pulling at my body with subtle differences I had not anticipated. Real atmosphere, not recycled ship air. but wind carrying scents of vegetation and industry, and the 1,000 organic processes of a living world. Real sunlight, not artificial lumens, warming my skin with radiation that felt clean after months of plasma conduit heat. I stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, simply breathing and feeling, before Maria touched my arm. "Come, we have only 18 hours, and much of that will be consumed by travel to and from the port district. Do not waste time standing still." The port district, designated for servant use, was a controlled zone several kilometers from the actual landing pads. We were loaded onto ground transport vehicles, massive tracked crawlers designed for cargo, but pressed into service for moving servant populations. The ride took 20 minutes through industrial zones, passing warehouses stacked with goods from across the sector, processing facilities where raw materials were refined into finished products, repair yards where smaller vessels underwent maintenance. The servant district itself was a revelation and a disappointment simultaneously. It was an area of perhaps 6 square kilometers, surrounded by security checkpoints and surveillance systems, where bonded servants from various ships were permitted limited freedom during shore leave. The architecture was utilitarian, but not actively hostile. Simple buildings housing taverns, food vendors, small markets selling cheap goods, and establishments offering services ranging from message transmission to temporary lodging. The population was diverse, servants from Imperial Navy vessels mixing with those from merchant ships, rogue trader crews, and even a few from Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessels. We all bore similar marks, brands or tattoos identifying our bonded status, property of our respective organizations. We all carried the same haunted exhaustion in our faces, the look of people who had survived conditions that exceeded human tolerance and knew they would return to those conditions soon. Maria led me through the district with the purposeful stride of someone who had planned this moment for years. First, we eat real food, not corpse starch, but actual prepared meals. Then we find a chapel and pray to the Emperor, in a space not owned by the dynasty. Then we simply walk and breathe and remember what it feels like to be human for a few hours. We found a small eating establishment, barely more than a stall with bench seating, that sold grilled meat and vegetables skewered on wooden sticks. The cost was 2 throne gelt for a portion. Expensive by any standard, but affordable with our allowances. I purchased 1 skewer and held it in my hands, staring at food that had recognizable components. Meat that had been muscle tissue on some animal. Vegetables that had grown in soil. Seasoning that came from plants rather than chemical synthesis. The first bite was transcendent. Flavor. Actual complex flavor built from natural ingredients, rather than the uniform blandness of corpse starch. Texture. Varying between the tender meat and the crisp vegetables. Heat from spices that burned pleasantly rather than the painful heat of the plasma conduits. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, making the skewer last as long as possible, because I knew this would be my only real meal before returning to the ship. Maria watched me with something like satisfaction. "You understand now why some servants request shore leave even knowing they must return. For 18 hours, we can remember what we are defending by surviving. Humanity is not just the grind of service. It is this: meals shared, sun on skin, the simple pleasure of choosing where to walk and what to see." After eating, we found a small chapel dedicated to the Emperor, maintained by a local priest who welcomed servants without prejudice. The chapel was modest, perhaps 20 meters square, with simple pews and an altar bearing the aquila. The priest, an elderly man whose face bore the peace of genuine faith, led a brief service for the dozen servants gathered there. In my 14th month aboard the Eternal Dividend, we arrived at Cyprian's Gate, a prosperous trade world in the Calixis sector. The announcement came during morning meal cycle. Selected servants would be granted shore leave, 18 hours on the planetary surface before mandatory return. The news spread through the lower decks with a mixture of desperate hope and suspicious caution. Shore leave was technically permitted by imperial regulations governing servant treatment, but actual implementation was rare and carried implications we all understood. The overseers selected 100 servants from across all sections, chosen apparently at random, though I suspected calculations of productivity and loyalty influenced the selection. I was among them, along with Maria, which surprised me until I realized she had never been granted shore leave in her 11 years aboard. The designation was simultaneously privilege and test. Horvat assembled us in the work bay and delivered instructions with his characteristic emotionless efficiency. You will have 18 hours planetside. You will remain in designated servant zones within the port district. You will not attempt to contact local authorities or seek employment elsewhere. You will conduct yourselves in a manner befitting representatives of House Corvallis. Failure to return within the allotted time will result in consequences not only for the absent individual, but for randomly selected servants from their section. This is collective responsibility. Your actions affect others. Remember this. The implicit threat was clear. Desertion was not impossible, but its cost would be paid by innocent servants who remained behind. The dynasty did not need to guard us closely if we would guard each other through the bonds of shared suffering and collective punishment. We were issued clean uniforms, better quality than our work coveralls, and given small allowances of currency, 3 throne gelt each. Barely enough to purchase a meal, but sufficient to give the illusion of economic agency. The branding on my left forearm, the House Corvallis mark, would identify me to any authorities as bonded servant property. But technically, I was free to move within designated areas. The shuttle ride to the surface was markedly different from the terror of my initial recruitment. This time, I could look through the viewports and actually process what I was seeing. Cyprian's Gate was a civilized world, not a hive-choked industrial nightmare like Varsavia. From orbit, I could see green spaces, actual forests, and agricultural regions. The cities were planned and structured rather than sprawling, cancerous growths. The sky was blue, a color I had almost forgotten existed naturally. The descent was smooth, professional, the pilot navigating through traffic control patterns with practiced ease. We landed at a commercial port district, a sprawling complex of warehouses, trading houses, and support infrastructure that serviced the hundreds of vessels visiting the system. The landing pad was surrounded by similar facilities, ships from a dozen different dynasties and trading concerns, all engaged in the complex business of interstellar commerce. When the shuttle ramp descended and I stepped onto the surface, the sensation was overwhelming. Real gravity. Not the artificial gravity of the ship's deck plates, pulling at my body with subtle differences I had not anticipated. Real atmosphere, not recycled ship air, but wind carrying scents of vegetation and industry and the 1,000 organic processes of a living world. Real sunlight, not artificial lumens, warming my skin with radiation that felt clean after months of plasma conduit heat. I stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, simply breathing and feeling, before Maria touched my arm. Come, we have only 18 hours, and much of that will be consumed by travel to and from the port district. Do not waste time standing still. The port district designated for servant use was a controlled zone several kilometers from the actual landing pads. We were loaded onto ground transport vehicles, massive tracked crawlers designed for cargo but pressed into service for moving servant populations. The ride took 20 minutes through industrial zones, passing warehouses stacked with goods from across the sector, processing facilities where raw materials were refined into finished products, repair yards where smaller vessels underwent maintenance. The servant district itself was a revelation and a disappointment simultaneously. It was an area of perhaps 6 square kilometers, surrounded by security checkpoints and surveillance systems, where bonded servants from various ships were permitted limited freedom during shore leave. The architecture was utilitarian but not actively hostile. Simple buildings housing taverns, food vendors, small markets selling cheap goods, and establishments offering services ranging from message transmission to temporary lodging. The population was diverse, servants from Imperial Navy vessels mixing with those from merchant ships, rogue trader crews, and even a few from Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessels. We all bore similar marks, brands or tattoos identifying our bonded status, property of our respective organizations. We all carried the same haunted exhaustion in our faces, the look of people who had survived conditions that exceeded human tolerance and knew they would return to those conditions soon. Maria led me through the district with the purposeful stride of someone who had planned this moment for years. First, we eat real food. Not corpse starch, but actual prepared meals. Then we find a chapel and pray to the Emperor in a space not owned by the dynasty. Then we simply walk and breathe and remember what it feels like to be human for a few hours. We found a small eating establishment, barely more than a stall with bench seating, that sold grilled meat and vegetables skewered on wooden sticks. The cost was 2 throne gelt for a portion, expensive by any standard but affordable with our allowances. I purchased 1 skewer and held it in my hands, staring at food that had recognizable components. Meat that had been muscle tissue on some animal, vegetables that had grown in soil, seasoning that came from plants rather than chemical synthesis. The first bite was transcendent. Flavor, actual complex flavor built from natural ingredients rather than the uniform blandness of corpse starch. Texture, varying between the tender meat and the crisp vegetables. Heat from spices that burned pleasantly rather than the painful heat of the plasma conduits. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, making the skewer last as long as possible, because I knew this would be my only real meal before returning to the ship. Maria watched me with something like satisfaction. You understand now why some servants request shore leave, even knowing they must return. For 18 hours, we can remember what we are defending by surviving. Humanity is not just the grind of service. It is this, meals shared, sun on skin, the simple pleasure of choosing where to walk and what to see. After eating, we found a small chapel dedicated to the Emperor, maintained by a local priest who welcomed servants without prejudice. The chapel was modest, perhaps 20 meters square, with simple pews and an altar bearing the aquila. The priest, an elderly man whose face bore the peace of genuine faith, led a brief service for the dozen servants gathered there. His sermon was about endurance and faith, themes common to imperial preaching, but his tone was different from Confessor Malthus aboard the Eternal Dividend, where Malthus spoke with stern authority demanding obedience. This priest spoke with compassion, acknowledging suffering. "You serve in conditions I cannot imagine," he said, his voice gentle but carrying. "You face dangers and hardships that would break those of us who live comfortable lives planetside. The Imperium asks much of you, perhaps more than is just by any measure of fairness. But your suffering is not meaningless. Every ship that sails the void carries the Imperium's purpose to distant worlds. Every journey you endure expands humanity's reach and defends against the darkness. The Emperor sees your sacrifice, even when others do not. Your names may not be recorded in histories, but they are written in his eternal ledger." I wanted to believe his words, to accept that my suffering served some greater purpose beyond the dynasty's profit. But after witnessing the casual indifference of the upper decks, after seeing human lives reduced to ledger entries, I found faith difficult. The Emperor, if he existed as more than a corpse maintained by machinery, was too distant to care about individual servants dying in plasma conduits. We served not divine purpose but economic imperatives, and no amount of prayer would change that fundamental reality. After the service, Maria and I walked through the district without particular destination. Simply walking, choosing our path without orders or duties, was a luxury I had forgotten existed. We passed small markets where vendors sold trinkets and practical items. We saw servants from other ships, recognizing the shared exhaustion and the careful way everyone moved. conserving energy even during rest because rest was temporary and work eternal. We found ourselves at the edge of the district, where the security perimeter was marked by tall fencing and servo-skull surveillance systems. Beyond the fence was the actual city of Cyprian's Gate, where free citizens lived lives unconstrained by bonded service. I could see ordinary people going about ordinary business, workers heading to jobs they could quit if they chose, families shopping in markets that offered more than basic necessities, children playing without brands marking them as property. A man approached us, a local worker judging by his clothing, carrying tools that marked him as some variety of manual laborer. He studied the brands on our arms and nodded with understanding. "Bonded servants?" he asked unnecessarily, already knowing the answer. "Yes," Maria replied. "From a rogue trader vessel currently in port. How long is your shore leave?" 18 hours. "We have, perhaps, 10 hours remaining." The man glanced at the security perimeter, then back at us. He spoke quietly, careful not to attract attention from surveillance. "I know people who can help servants disappear. Safe houses where you could hide until your ship departs. After that, you could seek work elsewhere, build new lives. The brands mock you, but Cyprian's Gate is large, and the authorities are not zealous about pursuing deserters. Many bonded servants have found freedom here. The offer hung between us, tempting and terrible. Freedom, real freedom. To choose our own paths rather than serve until death or uselessness. To eat real food every day. To sleep in beds. To work for wages rather than exist as property. The dream was intoxicating. "What happens to the servants we leave behind?" I asked, already knowing but needing to hear it confirmed. The man's expression showed he understood the dilemma. "Collective punishment, I assume. Your overseers would make examples to discourage future desertions. Some innocents would suffer for your freedom. How many servants have you helped escape?" Maria asked. "Perhaps 30 over the years. Most successfully integrate into local society. A few are recaptured, and I do not know what becomes of them after that. And the servants who remained on their ships after those 30 deserted? How many were punished in their place?" The man had no answer for that. He could not know, and perhaps did not want to know, the cost his assistance imposed on others. He meant well, offering escape to those desperate enough to accept it. But freedom purchased with others' suffering was not truly freedom. "Thank you for the offer," Maria said finally. "But we will return to our ship." The man nodded, unsurprised. "Most choose as you have. The bonds are not only physical. The knowledge that others will pay for your escape is often a stronger chain than any brand. I wish you Emperor's blessing in your service." He departed, leaving us staring at the fence and the free city beyond. So close, yet impossibly distant. The freedom we could theoretically claim, but at costs we could not accept. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of shore leave, showing us what we could never have, making us complicit in our own imprisonment through moral calculations designed by those who enslaved us. "Could you have done it?" I asked Maria. "If you were alone, if there were no others to punish in your place, could you have deserted?" She considered for a long moment. 11 years ago, when I was first brought aboard, I might have. I still had connections to my old life, still believed I could reclaim something of who I had been. Now, I do not know what I would do with freedom if I had it. The ship is all I know. My identity is bound to my service in ways I cannot easily articulate. Perhaps that is the final victory of the system, making us unable to imagine existence outside it. We spent the remaining hours walking, sitting in small parks maintained within the district, watching other servants navigate their brief freedom. Some drank heavily in the taverns, seeking oblivion before returning to service. Others slept in the temporary lodging, buying rest more complete than they could achieve aboard ship. A few engaged services of a carnal nature, Purchasing intimacy and human connection denied them in the crowded barracks where privacy was impossible. I used my remaining throne geld to purchase a small icon of the Emperor from a vendor, replacing the one I had hidden in my coveralls that had been lost months ago during a particularly brutal shift. The icon was cheaply made, mass-produced devotional art, but it represented something beyond its material value. A choice I had made with my own resources, however meager. A small act of agency in a life defined by total subordination. As the designated return time approached, we made our way back to the transport staging area. The other servants gathered there showed various responses to their brief freedom. Some seemed refreshed, their expressions slightly less haunted. Others looked worse, the contrast between shore leave and shipboard existence having highlighted rather than relieved their suffering. A few were absent, having chosen desertion despite the costs. I counted 93 servants when the overseers called roll, 7 missing from the original 100. The return shuttle ride was silent. No one spoke about those who had not returned, but we all understood what awaited us, the collective punishment that would be administered to discourage future desertions. The mathematical lesson that our individual freedom was worth less than the dynasty's need to maintain control over its human property. When we arrived back aboard the Eternal Dividend, the contrast was crushing. The clean air of Cyprian's Gate gave way to the ship's recycled atmosphere, thick with oil and human waste and mechanical odors. The natural light disappeared, replaced by harsh, artificial illumination. The sensation of being surrounded by living world gave way to the oppressive awareness of metal walls and void beyond. Nothing between us and death but ceramite and prayer. Horvat was waiting in the hangar bay. His expression revealed nothing as he counted us, noting the absences in his data slate. When he finished the count, he addressed us without preamble. 7 servants failed to return from shore leave. This represents a 7% desertion rate, within expected parameters. Collective punishment will be administered according to House Corvallis regulations. All servants in sections from which deserters originated will receive half rations for the next 30 days. Those who shared work assignments with deserters will receive no shore leave privileges for 2 years. These measures are necessary to maintain proper discipline and discourage future desertions. His tone suggested he was describing weather rather than condemning dozens of innocent servants to increased hardship. This was simply procedure, neither cruel nor kind, just the mechanical application of rules designed to maintain control. We were dismissed to our sections. In Maintenance Section Theta-7, one servant had deserted, a young woman named Kelis, who had been aboard only 4 months. Her decision to run meant everyone in our section would subsist on reduced rations for a month. Already inadequate nutrition cut further. The response among the servants was not anger at Kelis for her choice, but exhausted resignation. This was how the system worked. Individual freedom was made so expensive that most could not afford its price. That night, lying in my hammock and feeling hunger gnaw at my stomach as the reduced rations began their work, I understood the true genius of shore leave. It was not mercy or privilege, but a weapon wielded against us with precision. It showed us what we could never have, reminded us that freedom existed somewhere beyond our reach, and used our own morality to ensure we would not seize it. The chains were not only physical or economic, but psychological and ethical, binding us through our unwillingness to purchase freedom with others' suffering. Maria spoke from her adjacent hammock, her voice barely audible. Did we make the right choice? I do not know if right and wrong have meaning in our circumstances. We made the only choice we could live with. Whether that constitutes rightness is a question I cannot answer. Kelis is free now. Perhaps she will build a life on Cyprian's Gate. Perhaps our hunger for the next month purchased something valuable for her. Or perhaps she will be recaptured and made servitor, her freedom lasting only days before worse slavery claims her. We cannot know. We can only endure what we chose by returning. Shore leave had revealed itself as another form of torture, psychological rather than physical, but equally effective. It took the abstract concept of freedom and made it concrete, visible, almost touchable. Then it snatched it away and punished us for even considering its possibility. The cruelty was refined, calculated, more sophisticated than simple brutality, but ultimately more effective at maintaining submission. The eternal dividend departed Cyprian's gate 3 days later, carrying its cargo of goods and its cargo of human suffering into the void. The memory of 18 hours planetside would sustain some servants through the months ahead, giving them something to hope for during future shore leaves. For others, myself included, the memory was poison, a reminder of what was forever denied, making the present circumstances more unbearable by comparison. This was life aboard a rogue trader's vessel. Even mercy was a weapon. Even freedom was a cage. And we, the servants who made the dynasty's glory possible, were trapped in systems so sophisticated that we became our own jailers, choosing imprisonment over liberation because the moral costs had been calculated to exceed what we could pay. I have served aboard the Eternal Dividend for 3 years now. My body bears the scars of plasma burns, malnutrition, and the subtle radiation poisoning that kills slowly. My mind carries fragments of warp-touched memories that will never fully fade. I have watched 200 servants die and twice that number broken into servitors or madness. During a supply transfer with an Imperial Navy vessel, I spoke with their servants. Their stories mirrored mine exactly. Different ship, same suffering. I understood then that House Corvallis is not exceptionally cruel. This is simply how the Imperium functions. Billions serve and die in darkness so that the machine continues. There is no rebellion, no escape, no justice. There is only endurance. I will die aboard this ship, my body rendered into corpse starch, my name forgotten. But in the moments between shifts, teaching new servants how to survive, I find something resembling purpose. In the grim darkness of the far future, even this fragment of humanity is resistance. My life is horror, but it is mine, and I have lived it.